Sure, that's going. So tonight we're going to look at something kind of similar to the notes last week, because it's going to be all about inheritance. Only this time, instead of tracking the specific genes and alleles in self and looking at the probabilities of them being passed down, instead we're going to look at something which is called a pedigree, which is kind of similar to a family tree, except having to do with certain traits or certain characteristics. All right, so pedigrees, and specifically human pedigrees and human genetics, are what we are going to be looking into this evening. So if you remember back to when we were talking about our chromosomes and our DNA, we talked about how there are 23 total pairs of chromosomes in your normal body cells, which means that there are 46 total chromosomes that we have. So there's pairs 1 through 22, plus your sex chromosomes, which are your X and Y chromosomes. Remember, if you have XY, that means that you are a boy. And if you're a girl, you have XX chromosomes there. But the other 22 pairs, all the same. And so we have a total of 46 chromosomes in our human body. So those first 22 pairs get a special name. They are called autosomes. So not AutoZone, like the place that you take your car if you're having battery problems. Autosomes are pairs 1 through 22 of your chromosomes. So these are all of sort of like your basic body plan chromosomes that do not influence the sex of an individual. Whereas, like I mentioned, your sex chromosomes are your final pair of chromosomes here at the end. And these are what determine your sex. Again, XX for female and XY for male, at least in humans. Other animals have different sex chromosomes, but in humans, we have an X and a Y. If you have two X's, you are female. If you have an XY, you are male. So 22 autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. The reason that I want to bring that up now is because there are certain traits that are on autosome traits, and there are a small number of specific traits and diseases that are called sex-linked traits because they occur on one of the sex chromosomes. So as we're going through the notes today, you'll see a lot of autosomal traits and sex-linked traits. That's just referring to what type of chromosome they are on. If they are on one of your 22 kind of normal pairs of chromosomes, that's an autosome. If they're on that final XX or XY pair, that is a sex chromosome. So the main thing that we're going to focus on tonight are these diagrams called pedigrees. So a pedigree is a big chart that's sort of similar to a family tree, where it shows the relationships between parents, their parents and grandparents, and their children and grandchildren. The specific thing about pedigrees, though, is that it doesn't just list the names of everybody in the family. It shows specifically how certain traits are passed down from one generation to the next. So when we were looking at the traits in the last class, like the red hair and the freckles, we were doing our Punnett squares and calculating out the probabilities that one child would inherit a specific trait. A pedigree kind of zooms that scope out a little bit and says, what about everybody in the family? Who has this trait? Who doesn't have this trait? And how has it been passed down from generation to generation? So the shape of, so each one of these shapes represents a person. The type of shape represents something, whether or not it's filled in represents something, and how they are connected also represents something. So when you're reading a pedigree, there are a couple basic rules that are going to be the same across pretty much all pedigrees that you're going to see or come across. So for the most part, males are identified with a square shape. Females are identified with a circle shape. Usually, if somebody is affected with the trait, so if they have the trait, like if they have freckles or if they have brown hair, then they'll have a filled in shape. The color will depend on the pedigree. In this case, the filled in color is purple. So if their shape is filled in purple, then they have the trait. Unaffected individuals, so people who do not have the trait, are in have an empty, not filled in shape. And then certain people that we'll talk about later are called carriers. This usually happens when a disease is a recessive disease. So remember from last class, in order to have the recessive trait, you have to have the two small letter alleles, right? You had to have small f in order to not have freckles. You had to have small r in order to not have red hair. In order to have red hair, excuse me. In some cases, if you have the two recessive forms of a certain trait, that means that you'll inherit some type of genetic disease from your parents. So the people who do not have the disease, but have a copy of that recessive allele, so like if they are big F, little f, or big R, little r, then depending on what type of trait it is, sometimes they'll be marked as carriers, or they'll be kind of half filled in, meaning that they carry one allele for the trait, but they do not have the trait themselves. They do not have that hair color or that disease themselves. In terms of how they are connected, if they're connected with a line across like this, that means that they are the parents of the children. And then if they're connected by vertical lines, then those are the children. So for example, in this super simple pedigree that we have down here, we have 3 children from this set of parents, 2 girls and 1 boy. So here's just another way of looking at pedigrees. So again, horizontal line means that people are married, or even not necessarily even married, but that they've had children together. And then a vertical line indicates the children that they have had. If their shape is filled in, that means that they have that trait. So whatever trait so a pedigree is for one specific trait, whether that is hair color or eye color or a type of disease. Pedigrees only show us information about one trait. So if their shapes are filled in, that means that they have the trait and they're expressing it. So whatever the phenotype it is that we're talking about, remember, phenotype is what you can see on a person. So the filled in shapes represent that they have that trait. And then if they have empty shapes, it means they don't have the trait. And then finally, if they have the half-filled shape, that means that they carry one of the alleles, but they do not show the trait themselves. So some pedigrees don't indicate carriers, and we'll talk about which ones do and which ones don't here in just a second. Anybody have any questions about pedigrees so far, about any of the basics?
No.
All right, thanks, Paula. Appreciate it. So.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Fernando. Ooh, one more thing that I wanted to point out is that when you start getting a lot of people on your pedigree, you don't just want to be able to reference them as like, oh, the original couple's great-great-granddaughter, that was the second one, or oh, the first son of the second son of the first couple, right? That can be really confusing. Instead, what people who look at pedigrees will do will give the generations a Roman numeral, like 1. So these would be like, if these are the kids down here, then these are the parents right here, and then these are the grandparents, and these are the great-grandparents. So the first generation is numeral 1, numeral 2, numeral 3, and numeral 4. And then each people marked in that generation get their own number. So like this would be person 1-1, this would be person 1-2, this would be person 2-2, this would be person 3-5, this would be person 4-2, and so on and so forth. So really quickly, just to get a little bit of practice with reading the pedigrees, I want you guys to answer either out loud or in the chat the following questions. So are these following people male or female? So person 1-2, is that a male or a female?
This is male.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Paula's correct. 2, male. So person 1, 2, and square means male.
Male.
What about 2-4? What kind of person is that? Mm-hmm. Paula is correct again. 2-4 is a female. Yep, Pete, you're right.
Yes.
So here's 2-4. So generation 2, person 4 is right here. And they are a circle, which is a female. What about person 3-5? Is it a male or a female?
Female.
Mm-hmm. This one is a female.
Mm-hmm.
So generation 3 is right here, and person 5 is way over here. They are a circle, and they are a female. And then finally, what about person 4-1?
Male.
Male, exactly. Generation 4. So for those of you who don't know, in Roman numerals, IV represents the number 4. Just a V by itself represents the number 5. So IV is 4, and 4-1 is right here. That is a square, so that is a male. So that is how you not only find specific people in a pedigree, but also a little refresher on males versus females. So females are circles, males are squares, and we find specific people by looking for the generation first, and then what number they are in the generation. All right, so up next, we're going to talk about a couple different types of pedigrees you might see, and a couple different types of traits. So the first type of pedigree is called an autosomal dominant pedigree. So this pedigree represents a dominant trait. So that would be represented by a big letter in the genotype that is on an autosomal chromosome, which again is the normal, regular, non-sex-based chromosomes. So this type of pedigree shows how a dominant trait gets passed down through generations. So a couple different aspects of this pedigree is that if either one or both of the parents have the trait, that means that since it's dominant, it's pretty likely that at least one or more of the children will end up with the trait. Also, with autosomal dominant pedigrees, there are no carriers. The reason for that is because if you have a big A, or a big A, little a, in this case, then remember, if it's a dominant trait, then anytime that big letter shows up, you get the trait. So if we were thinking about the kind of example that we were doing last week with freckles, freckles was a dominant trait. So if you had a capital F at all, you'd have freckles. And so it's impossible for anybody to have the freckles gene and not show freckles. So that we don't have any carriers in here, because if they have the gene, then it's a dominant gene and they're going to show that trait. So in this case, we have a mom and a dad who are both having the trait. They're both have the big A, little a version. Does anybody remember the specific name that we called it when you had the big version and the little version of the gene? It was kind of a long, complicated word.
No, I don't.
That's all right. So when you have the two different types of the gene, the big one and the little one, that is called heterozygous. So we would say both the dad and the mom are heterozygous for the trait. They have the trait and they have the dominant and recessive alleles for it. So if they have 4 kids, then probability-wise, 2 of those 4 kids are going to be also be heterozygous for that trait, meaning they have the big A, small a. One of their kids, their daughter way over here on the right, is what's called homozygous, meaning that she has the 2 big letters together. So 2 of the same together is homozygous. And since she has 2 big letters, then she is homozygous for the trait. And then their other son over here on the far end is homozygous for the recessive version. So their one son does not end up getting the trait. They are not affected by the trait because they have the recessive genotype. So they don't have a big A. And since this is a dominant trait, if you don't have a big A, you don't have the trait. So this is a dominant pedigree. If one or more of the parents have it, then there's a good chance that half or more of the children will inherit it. And you only do not get the trait if you inherit the 2 recessive alleles, the 2 small letter alleles. So Does anybody have any questions about the dominant pedigree?
No, sorry.
No.
All righty. So up next, we have what's called an autosomal recessive pedigree. Again, it is autosomal, meaning that it's on one of the non-sex chromosomes, one of those 22 pairs of regular chromosomes. The two things that make it different from the dominant pedigree is that this is for a recessive trait. So now you only get the trait if you have the recessive alleles. And recessive pedigrees can also result in carriers. So let's say if we use an example from last time, let's say that the trait that we're interested in is red hair. So red hair was an autosomal recessive trait. The carriers that we were looking at last class only had red hair if they had the little r gene. So if you inherit, so if we now pretend like A is for red hair, little a, if you get big A, you're not going to get red hair. If you get little a, you will get red hair. You are affected by that trait. But you can also have carriers. So if you have big A, little a, that means that because you have the big A right here, you're unaffected by the trait. Because remember, in order for it to be a recessive trait, you have to have two recessive alleles, two small letter alleles in order to get it. So a big A, little a person is not going to be red-haired, but they are what's called carriers, meaning that they do have the red hair trait, the red hair gene, I should say. They don't have the trait, but they have the gene. They do have a little a in there. And if they produce children with somebody else that has a little a gene, then they could pass on the red hair trait to one of their kids. So for example, in this case, we have a dad and a mom who are both carriers. The dad and the mom, neither one of them have red hair, but they both are heterozygous. They both have the big A, little a. So they don't have red hair, but they could potentially have a kid with red hair because they are both carriers of the red hair gene. So if they have 4 kids, 3 of their kids are most likely not going to have red hair, right? The 2 girls over here and the boy over here, these guys do not have red hair. The one girl isn't even a carrier. She has no red hair genes at all. The middle 2 children, the boy and the girl in here, they do not have red hair, but they are carriers like their parents. They still have that red hair gene in there. It's just being powered by whatever the dominant gene is. And then they have one of their children, in this case, does end up having red hair. So even though it's a recessive trait, and even though both of the parents did not have red hair, they still were able to produce a boy who has red hair. So this is how the recessive pedigree works, how it generally shows up. Is you have very rarely get somebody that has the trait, but you could potentially get that from 2 people who do not have the trait as long as they are carriers. So again, it's recessive, so that means it's relatively rare to happen. Most of their children did not get red hair, but they still have a 25% chance of producing a kid with red hair because they were both carriers of that red hair gene. So if you remember from when we did our Punnett squares in the other class, if you cross a big A little a with a big A little a, then there is a 25% chance that one of their children will inherit a little a genotype. So on a dominant pedigree, again, no carriers. If you have the dominant gene, then you get the trait. So either you have it or you don't. That's it. On our recessive pedigree, even if you don't have it, you could still potentially pass it on to your children by being a carrier. So we have these people who do not have the trait, but they still carry one copy of the gene. And if two copies of those genes come together, then we end up showing the trait in the child. All right, any questions so far about the two different types of autosomal pedigrees that we've talked about?
No.
All right, so hopefully we feel pretty good with that. This is the stuff that's pretty similar to those notes that we were going through last class. One thing that is a little bit different, though, are sex-linked traits. So sex traits are produced by genes that live on the X chromosome. So I don't know if you guys got a good look at it earlier when we were looking at the chromosomes. But the X chromosome is a lot bigger than the Y chromosome. So there are a lot of genes that show up on the X chromosome that do not show up on the Y chromosome because there's just not enough space to fit them. So most of the sex-linked genes that we have discovered in science and so far on that X chromosome. So the way that sex-linked genes and sex-linked traits work is a little bit different than the normal autosomal traits that we've been looking at. So normally, right, you have two copies of a gene, one from your mom, one from your dad, and letters together make up your genotype. So you have the AA, you have the RR, you have the FF, that's your genotype. In sex-linked traits, that's still basically true for females. So for females, to show that it's a sex-linked trait, we'll usually indicate it by having a big X, meaning X chromosome, and then a letter for the trait itself, kind of up in the top right. So this would be like X big A, or X big A, X little a, and then X little a, X little a. So for females, it works basically the same as normal traits. We have two copies of the gene, we have two X chromosomes, and then when we put them together, we'll see which ones are dominant and which ones are recessive. Males are where it is different. In males, since we have Y chromosomes for males, that basically does not count for your genotype. So the male trait is entirely dependent on that X chromosome. So if you're male and you were looking at a dominant trait, if you inherit the dominant X chromosome, then you have the trait. If you inherit the recessive X chromosome, then you don't have the trait. So the Y basically doesn't even matter when it comes to the males. So unlike in females, where you could have an X big A, X little a, and still have the trait, in males, if you get for a dominant trait, if you get the dominant allele, you have the trait. If you get the recessive allele, you don't have the trait. And then for recessive traits, it's flipped. So for males, if you get the recessive trait, or if you get the recessive allele, then you get the trait. If you get the dominant allele, then you don't get the trait. And then females is just like it was when we were talking about our recessive example, like the red hair example. If you get 2 recessive alleles, then you get the trait. But if you get a dominant or a dominant recessive, then you do not have the trait. But you can still have the carrier, like we were talking about earlier in females. Males cannot be carriers of sex-linked traits. Either they have it or they do not. So for a sex-linked trait, in females, it works basically the same as a dominant or recessive trait like the other ones. In males, it all depends on what you inherit from your mom. So the mom is where you get the X chromosome from, and then the dad either gives you the second X chromosome for a female or the Y chromosome for the male. So for the most part, most of the sex-linked traits that are out there and that we're going to be talking about are types of diseases, and they're generally recessive traits. And so you have to have the 2 recessive alleles together in order to get the disease, in order to have the trait of having the disease. All right, so for another basic example of a sex-linked recessive pedigree, I just realized that this wording is kind of flipped. So anyways, this is still a good example. So whether or not it's a recessive or a dominant pedigree, I think this one is actually showing a dominant one. Or maybe it's recessive and they just have the colors flipped around. Anyways. So we have a male who just has the sorry, I'm getting thrown off. I never realized that before, is that the wording of this is all mixed around. So in this one, pretend like the black is when it's filled in and the red is when it's not, because that's what it's actually supposed to be showing. But regardless, we have the male has the 1 dominant gene, the 1 dominant X trait, and then the female has the 1 dominant and the 1 recessive X-linked trait. So again, over here we have the male children. And so in the male children, they got the Y from their dad. So they essentially have a 50-50 shot of getting the dominant version from their mom or the recessive version from their mom. Again, they can't be carriers because that Y trait, that Y chromosome, doesn't count towards the trait overall. So these male children either have the trait or they don't. The female children, on the other hand, could potentially either have the trait, not have the trait, or have the trait and be a carrier for the trait, like this example down here. So for the female children, it is based on the combination of their dad's X-linked trait and their mom's X-linked trait. So like I said, sex-linked traits work a little bit differently than kind of the normal ones that we've been looking at previously. Does anybody have any questions about the sex-linked traits and how they work so far? Any questions about this?
Nah, I'm good.
All right, cool. Thanks, Paula and Fernando. So one of the interesting kind of side effects of sex-linked traits is that for some sex-linked traits, they tend to have a bias, especially sex-linked recessive traits. They tend to have a bias of showing up in male children. And that's because for these traits, again, if your mom is a carrier, then if you're a boy, there's a 50-50 chance that you either get the recessive trait or you do not. Unlike with the female children, there's only a 33% chance that they get the trait and a 66% chance, or like a 60% chance, that they do not. And it all has to do with the fact that the males don't inherit a version of the trait from their dad. So even if the dad has the dominant version of the trait, that if it gets passed on to the daughters, they'll be safe from the disease. The male children can never inherit that dominant version from their dad. The version that they get has to come from their mom. So one example of this is colorblindness. So colorblindness is very rarely just the complete graying out of your color vision. For a lot of people, specifically for a lot of men, suffer from what's called red-green colorblindness, where they lose some of the red or the green processing ability in their vision. And so they can still see some colors, but not always the exact same as everybody else. So if you're not able to see red, for example, this reddish orange clown over here would have kind of like this weird greenish color, because that's how your brain interprets the signals that are coming in when you don't have that red color vision. So you might have seen these before, these kind of weird dot numbers. These are tests that were developed in order to help test for color blindness in people. Because if your color vision is normal, then you can see the number that's hidden inside, that's made up of the different colored dots. But certain people, depending on their color blindness, can't distinguish between the color of the number and the color of the dots that are surrounding it. So if you're not able to read the number inside of the dots, that could indicate that you're having some color vision problem issues. So again, the reason why colorblindness tends to be more inherited by boys than by girls is, like we were talking about, colorblindness is a recessive disease. So if you're a girl, you have to have X little b, X little b. But if you're a boy, you only have to have one X little b. So if your parents are both not colorblind, your dad has the dominant gene, and your mom has one dominant and one recessive gene. Because the dad has that dominant gene on his X chromosome, both of their girl children are going to inherit that one X from their dad. And so they're going to inherit his dominant color vision gene. So if your dad is not colorblind, then it's impossible for any of his daughters to be colorblind. One of the daughters might become a carrier if she inherits that recessive allele from her mom, but she will not be colorblind herself. She can see color vision just fine. However, if that dad passes his Y chromosome on, those will be his sons. And so now, if you are the son of a dad and a mom who is a colorblind carrier, now there is a 50% chance that the son will be colorblind or not colorblind. So whereas none of the female children of this couple are colorblind, there's a 50-50 shot that one of their sons will be colorblind. And it's all because of when you're a boy, you only have to inherit one recessive allele from your mom in order to get this disease, in order to get this trait. So that's why certain sex-linked diseases like colorblindness tend to show up more often in males than females, is because it's much more difficult for a female to end up with the double recessive alleles. Another X-linked disease is called hemophilia. This is an issue with blood clotting, where if you get a cut on your arm or your finger or something, you have a much more difficult time stopping the bleeding than somebody with a normal blood type. So somebody who's hemophilic could potentially bleed out and die from just a simple cut on their arm because they're just not able to get it to stop bleeding. Because unlike most people, where you can put a bandage on it for a couple hours and take it off and it started clotting up and forming a scab there, hemophiliacs, that does not happen. The wound just continues to bleed and not clot and scab over. Sometimes if that happens under the skin, you can end up with these pretty gnarly, what are called edemas, which are where you have blood pooling right underneath the surface of the skin. Never a good sign in a person. But again, just like with colorblindness, in this case, there's colors on the picture to indicate it, or we could say that it's the recessive X-linked gene. If the dad is normal and the mom is a carrier, then none of the daughters will get the hemophilia. It's just there's a 50% chance that they will either be totally unaffected or be unaffected but be a carrier for the disease. But over on the other side, there's a 50% chance that the sons will inherit hemophilia, since they get that Y chromosome from their dad, and either the healthy chromosome from their mom or the hemophilia chromosome from their mom. Another similar one is albinism. So this is when people are unable to produce the substance melanin, which is what gives your hair, your skin, and your eyes color. So people with darker skin have more melanin pigment in their skin than people with lighter skin. People with albinism have basically no melanin pigment. So they are super pale. They have super white hair and facial hair and eyebrows. This can also happen in animals too. So really rare forms of animals like white peacocks, all white peacocks, or penguins, or probably the most famously the all white tigers that you might see at certain zoos or safari places. They have the albinism trait. They are deficient in producing melanin. So normally this peacock would have super beautiful green and blue metallic colors. Albino peacock is just 100% pure white. They're not able to produce any color pigment in their feathers. So albinism is actually not a sex-linked gene. Albinism is just a recessive gene. So this is going back to that recessive autosomal pedigree and inheritance, where even if neither of the parents have the trait, if they both have normal melanin production, neither of them are albino. But they could be carriers for the trait. So maybe they're big A, little a for both parents. Then we could end up with a 25% chance that their child is not at all a carrier. They got both of the dominant traits, one from their dad and one from their mom. There's a 50% chance that their children are not albino, but they are carriers for the trait, just like their parents were. So maybe they inherited the dominant from their mom and the recessive from their dad, or they could have inherited the recessive from their mom and the dominant from their dad. And then there's a 25% chance that their child will end up with albinism, becoming albino, where they inherit both of the recessive alleles from each one of their parents. All right, cystic fibrosis is another disease that affects the lungs and happens in the same way, where you have a recessive allele that could potentially be passed down to one of the children, even if both of the parents are healthy. If they're both carriers, then they could potentially pass the disease down to their child. Sickle cell, same thing. All right, so I wanted to give you those last couple examples just to show you real life examples of diseases that affect humans across the globe that are caused by inheriting these different dominant or recessive alleles from parents down to their offspring. And one of the reasons why doctors will almost always ask you about your family history. So like, do your parents have any diseases? Did your grandparents die of any particular disease? The reason why they ask about that is because certain diseases are inherited from grandparents to parents to children. And so they want to see if you're likely to be more at risk for certain diseases if they were present in some of your close family members. So by creating these pedigrees, we can track patterns of inheritance of, really, you could do it for any trait, but for the most part, they're used for diseases to keep track of how likely is it that you're going to inherit a disease, or that you're going to pass down a disease to your children based on the family history of how that disease has been passed down in generations previously. So again, with these big pedigrees, the squares and circles represent the dads and the moms. And then we indicate the generations with these Roman numerals. And then the filled in circles and squares are people who have the trait that we're concerned with, who maybe in this case have the disease that we're interested in. And all of the unfilled circles and squares are people who do not have the disease. Right. And I think that is pretty much everything that I wanted to cover about pedigrees. Does anybody have any final pedigree questions, sex-linked trait questions, recessive or dominant trait questions? Any questions about anything that I've talked about so far?
Nah. Clear.
Alrighty. So
No, mister.
the homework for pedigree stuff is a pretty simple, kind of straightforward series of questions that have to do with certain pedigrees that I've posted for you guys. So, two different pedigrees. One about Huntington's disease, which is a real disease that is fatal if you inherit it. There's no known cure for it yet. And then something a little bit less serious, known as hitchhiker's thumb, which is a trait that you inherit from your family, where some people have a thumb that will bend like way back when they stick it out, where other people it'll go up more straight. So a little bit less serious. And it just asks you to use this pedigree to either just answer some basic questions about family members, how they're, like, who's brother and sister, who's a cousin to who, is this person male or female, but also about the disease. So who has the disease? Is it most likely dominant or recessive? And then some basic questions about, like, how many children, who inherited the Huntington's from who, how are people related? Are there any carriers of certain diseases? Stuff like that. All right, so does anybody have any questions about the pedigree homework? Hold on, I saw something. I think there's one more thing I wanted to mention. So on this pedigree right here, this second one, it's a little bit older pedigree, so it doesn't do the half filled in circles or squares for the carriers of a trait, like the hitchhiker's thumb trait. But there still could be carriers on this pedigree. So even though they're not demonstrated, because I think on the older ones, they just had trait versus no trait, and it wasn't until a little bit more recently that they started doing the half fill for the carriers. So even though there aren't any half-filled circles or squares on this pedigree, there could still be carriers for the hitchhiker's thumb. So I think because I saw number 11. So this is not a trick question. I promise that there are 2 individuals that are carriers of hitchhiker's thumb, even though they're not indicated with the half circle pedigree. So you have to figure out some other way to determine which individuals are most likely carriers. Alrighty, guys.